I was standing outside the living room window, an old toolbox in my hand, when I heard my son's wife slam the table and hiss, "Why is Dad? No, why hasn't that old man disappeared yet?" The house I paid for felt colder than the toolbox. Wind off Lake Tahoe. I had sold my entire working life to keep this family standing, and now I was the obstacle. I could have turned my back and walked away, but that night, I opened the door, stepped inside, and chose to face it. Under their frozen stares, in that room. Before I tell you what happened that night, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Now, let me tell you what really happened when I opened that door and walked into the living room. I walked into the living room without saying a word. The only sounds were the steady hum of the air conditioner and the dry ticking of the wall clock. Liam and Chloe froze as if the room had just changed ownership. I looked at them, not with the eyes of a father hoping to be understood, but with the eyes of a man long used to numbers, blueprints, and consequences that cannot be undone. I set the toolbox down beside the sofa. The edges were worn, the metal latch scratched and dull. I carried it out of habit, as if I were still the man ready to fix anything broken in my son's house. A leaking faucet, a creaking door, or a relationship starting to crack. I thought I could handle it all, if I just had a little more patience. No one spoke. Chloe was the first to turn away, pretending to straighten a cushion on the couch. Liam looked at me for a second, then dropped his eyes to the floor. That gesture was so familiar it sent a chill through me. It was the look of someone who had already decided, just waiting for the right moment to close the door behind someone else. I walked slowly toward the dining table. Water rings from their coffee cups were still on the surface. This house was always clean, modern, and quiet in a way that makes you feel unnecessary. When I signed the papers to buy it, I thought that silence meant peace. Now I understood. It was just empty space saved for someone being pushed out. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an old set of keys. The keys to the machine shop, the place where I spent nearly 40 years of my life, where the smell of oil and hot metal became more familiar than food from a kitchen. I placed them on the table right between Liam's chair and Chloe's. The sound of metal touching wood was clear, not loud, but unmistakable. "I was planning to give these to you," I said, my voice dry and steady. "But maybe I came too late." Liam looked up. His eyes wavered, not with regret but with concern. Chloe turned back, a tight smile appearing instantly, like a reflex she had practiced. "You must have misunderstood," she said. "We're just a little stressed, that's all." I didn't argue. At this age, I've learned that arguments only reveal more of what people are trying to hide. I looked around the living room, every detail carefully chosen. The leather sofa, the abstract painting on the wall, the wide glass doors facing the lake. 80% of the money here was mine, yet nothing carried any trace of me. I remembered the afternoon I signed the papers to sell the shop. The broker said it was a good price, $1,200,000. Enough for me to rest. I nodded without hesitation, because I was thinking of Liam. The long debts. The late-night phone calls. His voice tired, frustrated. I transferred money again and again until the numbers felt as familiar as my own heartbeat. In my mind, one figure stood out clearly, $850,000. That was what I spent to clean up Liam's messes, to buy this house, to make the family look stable from the outside. I never saw it as an investment. I saw it as duty. "I just stopped by to fix the faucet," I continued, as if what I'd overheard had never happened. "It's still leaking." Chloe gave a thin smile. "No need. We already called someone." That sentence closed the last thing inside me. Not because of the faucet, but because of the way she said "we," as if I had never been part of this house at all. I turned and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, Lake Tahoe was calm, the sunset washing the water in cold gray light. I had stood there many times, believing I was looking at my son's future. Now, I only saw an invisible line, and realized I was standing on the wrong side of it. When I turned back, I saw Liam staring at the keys on the table. His hand twitched slightly, as if he wanted to reach for them, then pulled back. In that moment, I understood. He wasn't looking at me as his father. He was looking at me as the last obstacle that needed to be removed. I took a deep breath. No one told me to leave right then. There was no shouting. No door slammed shut, but the truth was clear enough. I was no longer welcome. I was just a problem, waiting to be solved. And when I walked out of the living room, leaving the keys behind on the table, I knew I wasn't setting down old metal. I was setting down the final illusion that sacrifice by itself earns respect. That night, I didn't sleep. The guest room downstairs was so quiet I could hear the wind moving across the lake. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about the keys I had left on the table. Not because I missed the old shop. I missed the feeling. The belief that if I gave enough, everything would somehow be okay. The next morning I woke up early. Decades of work don't let you stay in bed once the light comes up. In the kitchen, Chloe was already gone to work. Liam was still upstairs. I made coffee, sat alone, and let my mind return to numbers. When emotions stop being reliable, I always go back to things that can be measured. I opened the kitchen drawer, looking for a notepad. The drawer caught slightly. I pulled harder, and a thin stack of documents slid out and fell onto the floor. I bent down to pick them up, planning to put them back neatly. Then I saw the name on the cover. My name! Under it was a dry administrative title. I didn't need to read it closely to know what it was. I've handled enough paperwork in my life. This wasn't a bill. It wasn't a repair contract. It was a file prepared to prove that I was no longer capable of making decisions for my own life. I sat down and opened it page by page. The language was careful, almost neutral, but every line pointed to the same conclusion. I was described as confused, slow in my thinking, in need of professional care. There was even a signature from someone I had never met. I didn't feel anger right away. What I felt was a cold emptiness. The words I'd heard by the window the night before came back with painful clarity. Worthless. I understood then that it hadn't been said in a moment of frustration. It was the conclusion of a plan that had already been prepared. I stacked the documents again and put them back exactly where I found them. I didn't want Liam or Chloe to know that I had seen them. Not yet. I took my coffee upstairs, sat by the window, and watched the lake slowly brighten. In my mind, the pieces began to fit together. Chloe's sudden questions about whether I still remembered dates clearly. Liam asking me to sign papers just to make things easier for the family. The way they talked about a nearby care facility as if it were an obvious option for me. I had ignored it all because I didn't want to believe the worst. Now I understood. I was no longer a father being helped. I was an asset that needed to be handled neatly. At noon I walked through the house. I ran my hand along the walls, the stair railing, the glass doors facing the lake. 80% of the money here came from me. But on paper my name appeared only in small lines written carefully enough that no one would notice. I remembered clearly the day I signed the contract. I trusted the broker. I trusted Liam when he said it was all just paperwork. I smiled quietly to myself. In my entire career I never signed off on a drawing without reading every detail. Yet with my own family I ignored the most basic thing of all. By evening Liam came home. We ate dinner in silence. Chloe talked about work. Liam nodded along. No one mentioned the night before. I watched them, not with hurt anymore, but with a new kind of clarity. Every gesture, every word, they all carried a different weight now. When dinner was over, Liam stood up to clear the table. I watched him, remembering the times I did that for him when he was small, when he still called me Dad, with trust in his voice. That feeling didn't return. Instead, a decision began to form, slow but steady. That night, I photographed the entire file with my phone. The living room light was bright enough for me to read every line clearly. I worked quietly, without rushing. Each photo was a step of pulling myself out of the role of the passive man. When I finished, I sat there staring at the screen. I realized the most painful part wasn't the possibility of being sent somewhere. What I couldn't accept was that they had decided for me, inside a house built with my own sweat. I put the phone away, stood up, and looked out at the lake once more. The water was growing dark, reflecting distant lights. I understood that from this moment on I could no longer pretend not to see. I had crossed the line between hope and truth. And once the truth is out in the open, there are only two choices: stay silent and be pushed aside, or stand firm and redraw the boundaries. I spent my entire life building things that don't collapse. I had no intention of becoming the weakest thing of all. The next morning I called someone I hadn't needed in many years. He answered on the second ring. His voice was still low and steady, as if time had never quite touched him. "I need you in Tahoe," I said, "not to play chess, to help me clean things up." He didn't ask questions, just said he'd be there by the weekend. We go back to when we were young, when every decision carried consequences in court. I trust him because he's never confused sympathy with duty. While I waited, I behaved as usual. I fixed a few small things around the house, made coffee every morning, spoke just enough not to draw attention. Liam and Chloe seemed relaxed again. They thought I had accepted my place, like an old piece of furniture set quietly in the corner. That comfort made them careless. I heard them talk about future plans, new expenses, about how once everything's settled, the house would be transferred cleanly. No one mentioned me. In their minds, I was already dealt with. That weekend, my old friend arrived in the afternoon. I introduced him as a chess buddy. Chloe smiled politely. Liam shook his hand, cautious but not suspicious. Dinner was prepared with more care than usual, as if they wanted to prove everything was still under control. We sat down at the table. I let the conversation drift through harmless topics: weather, traffic, the lake. When the main course was served, I placed my hand on the table, light but firm. "I want to talk about money," I said. The air changed instantly. Chloe set her fork down. Liam looked up, his brow tightening. "I've spent $850,000. I continued, my voice even. "On debts, on this house, on keeping everything from falling apart. I want it all clearly documented." I took a folder from my bag. Not thick, not complicated. A simple debt acknowledgement. I placed it in the center of the table and turned it toward Liam. "Just for transparency," I said. "Family should be the clearest of all." Liam let out a dry laugh. "What are you talking about, Dad? That was money you helped me with." "Help or not, it's still money," I replied. "And money needs to be recorded." Chloe stepped in, her voice softer. "You're making this tense for no reason." I looked straight at her. Tension started when people decided I no longer understood what was happening. Silence stretched. My friend said nothing. He just watched. Liam pushed the papers away. "I'm not signing," he said. "There's no reason." I nodded as if I expected that. I took out my phone, set it on the table, and slid it toward them. "Then I'll explain the reason," I said. I opened the photos I had taken. Page after page appeared clearly on the screen. My name, the cold descriptions. Chloe's face drained of color. Liam stared at the screen, lips pressed tight. "You were planning to use this," I said slowly, "to decide for me." Chloe jumped to her feet. "You don't understand. I understand perfectly," I cut in. "Enough to know this isn't a misunderstanding." There was no pretending anymore. Liam slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising. "You can't do this to me." I looked at him. No anger left. Only the fatigue of someone who has already seen the ending. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm just done closing my eyes." I turned to my old friend. He gave a small nod, a signal that it was time. I took out another set of papers, thinner, and placed them on the table. When I signed the house contract, I said I added one condition. I pointed to the marked line. "Lifetime residency. No one can force me out of here, unless I choose to leave." Liam read it, his face hardening. Chloe stepped back as if the room had suddenly shrunk. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "But this stops now." No one answered. Dinner ended in silence. My friend stood, thanked them politely, then looked at me. I nodded. We both knew the hardest part was over. What remained was just consequences. After they left the table, I stayed seated, looking at the papers lying still. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt like I had straightened a pillar that had been knocked out of place. That night I stood on the porch, listening to the wind coming off the lake. I knew I had shifted from being passive to being in control, not for revenge, but to make sure that from this point on no one would ever decide my life without me again. After that dinner, the house was no longer the same. No one said it out loud, but every step became more careful. Liam avoided my eyes. Chloe moved softly, as if afraid of dropping another piece of the truth. I stayed, not as a guest, but like evidence they couldn't put away. The night came slowly. I sat in the living room, reading through the papers I had placed on the table the night before, not to find anything new, but to make sure I hadn't been mistaken. At this age, I don't allow myself to act on sudden emotion. Everything I do has to hold up when daylight shines on it. Close to midnight, I heard hurried footsteps from upstairs. Not normal movement. There was urgency in it. Impatience. I stood and walked slowly toward the stairs. The hallway light flicked on. Liam was standing there, a stack of papers in his hand. He startled when he saw me. "Dad, you're not sleeping?" he asked, the tension clear in his voice. "I sleep when things are settled," I said. His eyes darted toward the living room where the file was still on the table. I didn't need to ask what he was planning. When people lose control, their first instinct is always to erase the evidence. Put them down, I said. I didn't raise my voice. Liam didn't listen. He turned and moved quickly toward the back door. I followed, unhurried. Outside, the wind off the lake was colder. Moonlight spilled across the concrete patio, making everything painfully clear. You don't have the right to keep those, Liam said, his voice tight. I have the right to keep the truth, I replied. He stopped and turned to face me. In that moment, I didn't see my son. I saw a man backed into a corner, afraid because his calculations were no longer in his hands. He stepped forward as if trying to move past me. I didn't step back. I stood still, solid the same way I once stood in front of machines that weighed several tons. Finally, he let go. The papers fell to the ground. No shouting, no chaos. Just a truth stopped before it could disappear. We stood there for a few seconds. Then another voice came from behind us. Grandpa. I turned. Sarah stood in the doorway, a jacket thrown on hastily, eyes red, but steady. In her hand was a phone, the screen still lit. I looked at it and understood immediately. I heard everything Sarah said, her voice shaking but clear. Not just tonight. Liam spun around. What are you doing? He snapped. Sarah didn't answer her father. She walked over and stood beside me. I recorded it, she said. The times they talked about you. The times they said it was almost done. Just a little more. The air drained out of the space. Chloe appeared in the doorway, her face going pale when she saw the phone in her daughter's hand. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if every explanation had already expired. I looked at Sarah. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said, but I didn't want you to face this alone. In that moment, something inside me broke, and was stitched back together at the same time. Not joy, confirmation. That I wasn't entirely wrong to believe in family, even if that belief had been placed in the wrong hands. We went back into the living room. No one sat down. Sarah placed the phone on the table next to the papers. Everything lay there in the open. The silence now was heavier than any accusation. I think there's one more thing everyone should know, I said, breaking the quiet. Liam looked at me, his eyes empty. Chloe turned away, as if she already knew what was coming. I've invested, I said slowly. Not directly. Through an intermediary fund. Liam frowned. Invested in what? The company you work for, I replied. The words landed softly, but the impact was anything but. Liam stepped back as if realizing he was standing on ground that was no longer solid. He opened his mouth, then said nothing. Sarah looked at me surprised, but didn't ask. I didn't do it to monitor you, I continued. I did it because I didn't want everything I built ending up in the hands of people who don't understand its value. Chloe let out a dry laugh. You think you've won? I shook my head. No. I think the game is over. No one spoke after that. Enough truth had been laid bare. Everyone in the room had to face their part. Liam had nowhere left to hide behind excuses. Chloe had no script left to control, and Sarah, standing between it all, had chosen a side without being asked. That night, when everyone went to their rooms, I stayed in the living room. I picked up the papers and stacked them neatly. I didn't feel relieved. I just felt tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a weight for too long and finally setting it down. Outside Lake Tahoe was perfectly still. I looked out at it, knowing morning would come. But before the light arrives, there are nights that force people to look straight at what they tried to hide. And tonight, no one in this house could pretend not to see anymore. The next morning the house woke up more slowly than usual. No one was rushing. No one was avoiding anyone. It felt as if the night before had drained the last bit of noise from the place. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the lake wrapped in a thin layer of mist. There was no sense of victory, just enough calm to take a deep breath. Liam and Chloe came downstairs late. They didn't look directly at me. I wasn't waiting for that. Everything that needed to be said had already been said during the night. Now it was time to restore order the way I always did, with projects once the structural problems were finally exposed. I'm not asking you to leave right away, I said, when we were all seated at the table. This is still a family home. But starting today, things will be different. Chloe pressed her lips together. Liam gave a very slight nod, as if every movement had to be weighed. The basement is still empty, I continued. You can move down there, not as punishment, just to give everyone the distance they need. No one argued. Sometimes silence is the clearest form of agreement. All the money I've spent, I added, will be documented. Each month you'll repay a portion. Not because I need the money, Because I need respect. Liam opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally he said, I understand. I didn't respond. I knew that understanding takes time to prove itself. Sarah sat beside me, her hand resting on her teacup. She hadn't said much since everything came apart, but I saw something new in her, a steadiness, like she had crossed a threshold without anyone pushing her. After breakfast, Liam and Chloe began packing. I didn't help. I didn't supervise. I went outside, down to the small dock behind the house. The morning wind was cold but clean. I sat there watching the water ripple. In my hands was the old toolbox. I'd carried it my whole life, fixing machines, fixing doors, fixing things you can touch. For a long time I believed that with enough patience people could be fixed the same way. Now I understood some things don't need fixing. They need letting go. I stood, walked to the edge of the dock, and didn't throw the box. I simply let it drop into the water. It sank slowly, without a loud sound. A small ring of ripples spread out, then disappeared. I didn't feel regret. I felt lighter. When I went back inside, Sarah was waiting by the door. Are you okay, Grandpa? She asked. Better than before, I said. She smiled for the first time since the night before. Are you staying here? She asked. I am, I said, but not the old way. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm. Liam left early, came home late. Chloe spoke less. The house wasn't tense anymore, but it wasn't warm either. I didn't try to pull them closer. I let everything stand where it belonged. I took time for myself, walking around the lake, reading, sitting still without feeling useless. Sometimes Liam and I talked about small things. No past, no distant future. Just short conversations, polite, contained. One afternoon, Sarah brought me a glass of water and set it on the table. Thank you, she said. For what? I asked. For standing your ground, she replied. If you hadn't, I don't think I would have dared to. I looked at her and realized that not every legacy is written on paper. Some things are passed down through action, at the exact moment they're needed. As evening fell, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the living room window. The last light of day rested on the lake, quiet, clear. I thought back to the question I'd overheard through the window that night. Why hadn't I disappeared yet? Now I had the answer. I stayed to redraw the boundaries, to remind myself that sacrifice doesn't mean erasing who you are, to live the years I have left not as a burden, but as a man with worth even if he stands alone. I took a sip of wine and looked around the house, no longer foreign to me. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need promises. I only needed the truth to be placed where it belonged. And that night, as darkness settled over Lake Tahoe, I stood there alone but not lonely, knowing that for the first time in a very long while, everything was finally standing firm. If you've listened this far, thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. If it made you think about family, about boundaries, about respect, tap like to show your support. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And share this if you believe someone else needs to hear it. Your presence is the reason stories like this continue to be told. Thank you for listening.